Okay, so get ready because today we are diving into the surprisingly complex world of sugar.
Oh, I like that, diving in. Because it really is a whole world. You think it's just sweet, right?
Yeah.
But we're going beyond your pantry today. We're getting into trade agreements, customs regulations, the whole bit.
You're telling me. I dove into this research you sent, and yeah, it's a lot more than I ever expected. Like, did you know there are legal battles about sugar?
Oh, absolutely. And that's what I find so fascinating about this topic. Something so seemingly simple, but it's intricately tied to global economics and, as you said, even legal battles. Where do you even begin with something like this?
Well, I figured we should start with the basics,
Right.
Like, sugar isn't just sugar, is it? There are all these different types, at least from what I gathered looking through everything.
That's exactly right. It's not as simple as it seems. A good place to start is understanding how those different types are classified. And this is where it gets a little technical. We're talking about things like polarimeter readings. Have you heard of that?
I saw that term in the research and was like, wait, is this a physics experiment or are we talking about sweeteners? What even is a polarimeter reading?
It does sound a bit like science fiction, doesn't it? Basically, it involves shining polarized light through a sugar solution and observing how it changes. The degree to which the light twists or rotates tells us the concentration of sucrose in the solution, which is the pure sugar we're most familiar with.
Okay, so it's a way to measure sweetness, essentially. But how does that play into global economics? You mentioned legal battles earlier.
This is where it gets really interesting. See, those polarimeter readings, they help determine how sugar is classified for import duties. And a sweeter product, well, that might mean higher taxes. The amount of actual sugar in something is called its raw value, and that's a key figure for both international trade and taxation. We'll dive deeper into the legal side of things a bit later, but just know that there have been cases where companies have tried to get around these classifications. It can get pretty intense.
Wow, okay. This is already making my head spin and we're just talking about how it's measured. Okay, let's get into some actual types of sugar. We got a whole list here. Jaggery, raw sugar, refined sugar.
And don't forget Panela and Piloncillo. These are less common in the US, sure, but they're fascinating examples of how sugar processing varies around the world.
Right. So let's break it down. What are we even dealing with here? Let's start with Jaggery, since that one seems to be having a moment.
Jaggery is a great example of what we call a non-centrifugal sugar. It's made by simply boiling down sugarcane juice until it solidifies, without the spinning and separating that you get with other processes. It retains more of the molasses, which gives it that distinct, rich, almost caramel-like flavor.
Okay, so it's less processed than, say, the white sugar most of us are used to. What about raw sugar? Is that also sugarcane based?
It is. Raw sugar is essentially what you get after the sugarcane juice is boiled and some of the molasses is removed.
Yeah.
It still has that slightly brown color and a bit of that molasses flavor.
Gotcha. So if you keep refining it, removing even more molasses, you end up with good old white sugar, the kind we put in our coffee.
Precisely. Refined sugar is basically pure sucrose at that point. It's had almost all the molasses removed, giving it that sparkling white color and neutral sweetness that's so versatile for things like baking.
And what about those other two, Panela and Piloncillo? I'll be honest, I don't think I've ever seen those in my pantry.
They might not be as common here in the US, but they're definitely staples in other parts of the world, often made from sugarcane too. Panela is essentially unrefined whole cane sugar. Think of it as a solid form of sugarcane juice, often sold in blocks or cones. You might find it at Latin American markets. Piloncillo is very similar, really popular in Mexico and Central America. Also unrefined cane sugar, but often molded into cones.
So it's amazing how many different cultures have their own versions of sugar, even though it all stems from the same source, sugarcane. It's incredible. But how come we don't see more Panela or Piloncillo in regular grocery stores here? Is it just a matter of taste?
Taste is definitely part of it, I'd say, but this is where those global economics we mentioned earlier come into play. See, the United States has this system that regulates how much sugar is imported from other countries, and that has a big influence on what actually ends up on our shelves.
Ah, you're talking about the U.S. sugar quota system, right? It's all starting to make sense now.
Yeah.
But tell me more about that. Like, why does that quota system even exist in the first place?
Well, the U.S. sugar quota system is essentially the government's way of balancing the interests of domestic sugar producers, like those who grow sugar beets here, with the need for sugar imports to meet the overall demand. It's a delicate balancing act for sure.
So it's kind of a way to protect those American sugar farmers from being undercut by cheaper imports coming in from other places. Makes sense. That's important.
Exactly. By ensuring a more stable price for domestic sugar, it really benefits American farmers and the entire agricultural industry as a whole.
Okay, that makes sense. So let's say a country wants to export its sugar to the U.S. What do they need to do? I saw something called CQEs while I was reading through everything.
You're talking about certificates of quota eligibility. Good catch. You've been doing your homework. These certificates are like golden tickets for sugar exporters. They allow countries to ship specific amounts of sugar to the U.S. at lower tariff rates. Without a CQE, it gets really expensive to bring sugar into the U.S. market.
So it's not just a free-for-all. There are rules and regulations, and those CQEs are the key to playing the game, basically.
Precisely. And not just any country can get a CQE. In fact, the countries that currently hold these certificates are a pretty interesting mix. Argentina, Australia, Brazil, and quite a few others. It's a global group, for sure.
So a country might have tons of sugar ready to go.
Right.
But if they don't have one of those CQEs, they're out of luck. Or at least facing some pretty steep taxes.
You got it. It's all part of this intricate web of international trade we're talking about. And it gets even more interesting. Did you know there are different tiers of sugar quotas? There's one specifically for refined sugar on top of everything else.
Wait, so there's more than one quota?
Oh yeah. The U.S. has this whole three-tiered quota system. You have the overall quota for sugar in general. Then there's a separate one just for refined sugar, and then another one specifically for specialty sugars. It's like a way to fine-tune the flow of all the different kinds of sugar coming into the country.
This is way more complex than I ever imagined.
Yeah.
So we've got these different types of sugar, this elaborate quota system. How in the world do we even begin to figure out what to call it all and how much it should cost to import? That's where customs gets involved, right?
That's exactly where U.S. customs regulations come in. They have a whole system for classifying sugar when it arrives in the U.S. And that classification determines which tariff code applies and ultimately how much duty is paid to actually bring it into the country.
Man, it sounds like a massive undertaking. How do they even begin to make sense of all this? Is there like a sugar flow chart they follow or something?
Well, they don't have a flow chart, but they do have this massive book called the Harmonized Tariff Schedule of the United States. It's like the sugar Bible for customs officials.
A sugar Bible, huh? That sounds good. Intense. Does it at least have pictures?
Sadly, no. Just a whole lot of numbers and very, very precise descriptions. But hey, it's how they keep track of all the different kinds of sugar coming into the country. Each type of sugar has its own specific code. Like you've got codes for raw sugar, refined sugar, even sugar syrups. It's a whole world of classification.
Okay, I'm starting to get a sense of it. So let's say a shipment of, I don't know, Panela from Guatemala arrives at a U.S. port. What happens next? Walk me through it.
Okay, so first things first, customs officials would examine the shipment, right? They'll likely take samples to actually test the sugar's purity, probably using those polarimeter readings we talked about earlier, and make sure it matches the declared classification. Basically, is it actually Panela, or is someone trying to slip something else in under a different tariff code? They gotta check.
So they're making sure no one's trying to pull a fast one and get a lower tariff rate? It's like sugar smuggling, but with paperwork.
Exactly. It's all about accurate classification. Once they've confirmed what it is, they'll use the correct tariff code from that massive book we talked about to calculate the import duties.
There's a combination of science, paperwork, maybe even a bit of detective work, it sounds like.
You could say that. And this is where it gets even more interesting. Remember we were talking about sugar syrups before? Well, there are very specific rules about how much non-sugar solids they can contain, and that can actually impact their classification and the duties owed.
Hold on, so we're talking about molasses, right? Like the kind that goes in gingerbread cookies.
That's the one. And there was actually this fascinating legal case about this, Heartland Byproducts v. United States and the Sugar Beet Association. Basically, a company was trying to import a sugar syrup that had a higher amount of molasses than usual.
Sounds like they were trying to find a loophole to pay less in those import duties.
Right. You could definitely see it that way. Their argument was that since molasses is a natural byproduct of sugar production anyway, it shouldn't count towards those non-sugar solids limits. But the courts ultimately disagreed with that. They ruled that the syrup was subject to the higher duty rates because it had too much molasses.
Wow. So even molasses can lead to a legal showdown. I guess there's really a lot at stake when it comes to this whole global sugar trade, even down to those super specific details.
Absolutely. These regulations, they might seem like technicalities, but they have real-world implications. for businesses, for economies, even for international relations. It's all connected.
Okay, you've convinced me. Sugar is officially more complex than I ever imagined. We've gone through all these different types, from raw to refined, Panela to Piloncillo. We learned about quotas and customs. But there's one type we keep coming back to, and that's Jaggery. What is the deal with Jaggery, and why is it having such a moment right now? It really does feel like Jaggery is more than just another type of sugar. Like it's got this health halo around it, you know? Is there any truth to that? Is it actually better for you than regular sugar?
Yeah, that's a question a lot of people have, and it's a little tricky. I mean, Jaggery does retain some of the natural minerals and vitamins from the sugarcane juice because it's less processed, right?
Right.
But at the end of the day, it's still primarily sugar. So from a purely nutritional standpoint, it's not like drastically healthier than other types of sugar, unfortunately.
Okay, so no magic bullet there.
No,
but I'm
yeah.
still seeing it everywhere. What gives? Is it just really good marketing?
Well, marketing definitely plays a role, for sure. But it's not just hype, I think. There's a real shift happening in terms of consumer preferences. People are just more aware of what's in their food these days, right? They're looking for options that feel less processed, more authentic, and Jaggery kind of fits that bill.
It does have that straight from the source kind of vibe.
Right, and the thing is, it's actually really versatile. People use it in traditional Indian sweets, of course, but also in savory dishes, even in drinks. It's a staple in India, Southeast Asia, and its popularity is spreading to other parts of the world, too.
Speaking of India, I read that they're like the major Jaggery producer. So are they cashing in on this whole global Jaggery boom?
That's a great question, and it circles back to those global economics we keep talking about, because while India is a Jaggery powerhouse, there are a few factors that make it tricky for them to fully capitalize on the global demand.
Like what?
Well, for one thing, there's competition. Other major sugar exporters, like Brazil, for example, they have a more established infrastructure for global trade already in place. And while demand for Jaggery is definitely growing, it's still a relatively niche market compared to the overall global sugar trade, if you think about it.
So even though India might have the Jaggery, actually getting it to the rest of the world in a way that's competitive, that's the challenge.
Exactly. And then on top of that, you have all the complexities of international trade regulations, tariffs, just the whole market dynamics thing we've been talking about. It's a complicated puzzle for any country to solve, even when something is super trendy.
Man, I'm starting to see a real pattern here. Sugar might seem simple on the surface, but it's this whole hidden world of complexity that I don't think most people even realize exists.
You nailed it. It's incredible how something so commonplace, something we all probably use every day, can be so intertwined with global economics, regulations, cultural preferences. We even talked about legal battles over molasses. Who knew?
Seriously, if you had told me at the beginning of this that we'd be talking about everything from polarimeter readings to international trade agreements, and yes, that whole legal case about molasses, I wouldn't have believed you.
This has been a fascinating deep dive.
I've had so much fun exploring it all with you, and hey, maybe the next time you reach for some sugar, whether it's for your coffee or a recipe or something, you'll think twice about the journey it took to get there.
I definitely will.
Yeah.
And hey, maybe I'll even give Jaggery a try. Why not?
Now that's what I like to hear.